his very existence as a mayor is a warning to America about where America has been heading. There are a few of us that have been pointing to this for many years.
Today's guest is former Congressman Louie Gohmert, who represented Texas in the United States House of Representatives for 18 years. Before serving in Congress, he was a Texas judge. During his time in Washington, he became one of Israel's strongest and most outspoken defenders, consistently supporting Jerusalem as Israel's undivided capital, opposing the two-state solution, and warning about the growing threats posed by Iran, radical Islam, and the Muslim Brotherhood. Today, we'll discuss Zohran Mamdani's call to arrest Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, the legacy of Senator Lindsey Graham, the rise of anti-Semitism, America's relationship with Israel, and what Congressman Gohmert believes the West still refuses to understand. Congressman Louie Gohmert, welcome.
Well, it's great to be with you, Daniel. Thank you.
Congressman, I never thought I'd ask this question in America. The mayor of New York has called Benjamin Netanyahu a war criminal and wants him arrested if he comes to the city. As a former judge and congressman, what was your reaction to that?
Well, first of all, I take people as we get them. And when someone says they are a Marxist Muslim, well, right off the bat, I know that they are a complete liar because, as Dostoevsky made clear in the 1800s when he was refuting the writings of an idiot named Marx, he said the problem with Marxism is atheism. You can't be a Marxist and not be an atheist. Marxists are atheists because for a Marxist, the government leaders, that little fine veneer of leaders with all the others just being the low-level people, they're all atheists. That's what a Marxist is. So it's a bit of an oxymoron to say someone is a Marxist Muslim. So right off the bat, before I knew anything else about him, when I knew he was saying, I'm a Marxist Muslim, I knew he was a liar. And so that puts in perspective anything he might say after that. Make sense?
Sure does. Now, Zohran Mamdani represents one politician. Is he warning about where America's headed?
I think that his very existence as a mayor is a warning to America about where America has been heading. And there are a few of us that have been pointing to this for many years. I was belittled back nearly 2 decades ago by a liberal channel that I don't choose to mention, but I had heard from a woman who lived in the Middle East, and she said, you cannot use the names I give you because they'll know who told on them, but we have some radical Islamist leaders who send their pregnant wives to America to have children and then bring them back and then teach them to hate America, knowing they can always go back as America haters and be American citizens. And I brought that up nearly 2 decades ago, and that this was a problem. And there was a hotel apartment complex owned by a Turkish company that was on Central Park. I mean, it was right beside it. And they advertised, and they brought a lot of Muslim pregnant married women of Muslim leaders would send their wives in their last trimester, and it costs a lot of money. But they would make sure that they had an OB-GYN, and they made sure that when the child was born, he went back to the Muslim country with an American passport. And since then, I don't have to give the names that she gave me, but there's just all kinds of examples. For example, we know that President Morsi, that won narrowly and probably with a lot of cheating in Egypt, he became president and then immediately started destroying their constitution. And the masses in Egypt were Muslim, but they did not want a radical Islamic Muslim brother president. And so they took to the streets, the largest demonstration in the history of the world, 30 million or so. And the Muslim Brother infiltrated. They burned down a church, some churches and a synagogue, but and tried to blame it on the peaceful demonstrators. But Morsi sent his wife twice to America to have a baby. And so we've known this kind of infiltration is going on. And by the way, Daniel, the only American citizen that I'm aware of that was ordered murdered by a U.S. president. It was ordered for a drone strike to take him out, took out him and his son. Alawaki was an American citizen because his parents came over on a visa, student visa. They had him, and then they took him back to Yemen and taught him to hate America. And then we know I can understand why Obama would want to take him out because he had ties to the White House. He was photographed leading Muslim staff members on Capitol Hill in prayer at the Capitol. The Bush administration allowed him to participate in 9/11 ceremonies at the Pentagon. All the while, he was working with our enemies as basically a double agent. They thought he was a double agent, but it turned out he was more of a triple agent. But he was one of those birthright tourism kind of guys. And also, we know that Hassan, that was the Fort Hood shooter, killed 13 people at Fort Hood. Alawaki made clear to him, you could not serve in the United States Army and be a true Muslim. And so he took out 13 U.S. Army military troops. This is the kind of thing that's been going on for many, many years, and we have been allowing it to go on. And so Mamdani is just more of what's been coming for quite some time. Not many of us, some of us have been trying to sound the alarm for decades now, and we're now seeing the fruition of people not paying attention.
Yeah. Now, you spent nearly 2 decades inside Congress. When did you first realize that support for Israel was beginning to change? Was there a moment when you said something is different?
Yes, but understand too, Daniel, the APAC conventions in Washington, they were huge, 5,000 plus. Lots of students came from across America, and all of that was encouraging to see that many Americans supporting Israel. But all of that time, APAC stayed mad at me because anytime there was a letter or there was that they wanted members of Congress to sign, or there was a bill, resolution supporting Israel that they wanted us to sign, I was all for it unless it had a line in there about wanting a two-state solution. And I'd mentioned to Prime Minister Netanyahu a couple of times in private visits that there has never been a time when Israel gave away land trying to buy peace that the land was not used later as a staging area from which to attack it. And that's also true, as you well know, of Gaza. I mean, that was Israel. It was quite the oasis with Israelis living and thriving in Gaza. And I would submit it was a promise that God made to Abraham. And they had greenhouses, they were self-sufficient, providing food for themselves, they had jobs. And all of a sudden, and Prime Minister Netanyahu was not the prime minister at that time, as you know, in 2005, but they were convinced by friends like some in America, leaders in America, in Europe, and others, saying, look, Israel, look, if you will just do this one unilateral act where you get nothing back, then finally the world will see that you truly want peace, that you're the one that wants peace. Just give all the land in Gaza to Palestinians and they'll the world will see, everyone will love you for it. And back at the time, I'm going, no, that's not the way this works. It doesn't work out that way. And I remember footage on the news of Israelis leaving, weeping, leaving their homes, their greenhouses, their jobs, the manufacturing, the things that they had produced and built with their own hands, and they were weeping. They didn't want to go. They were upset. And all these years later, there's a price being paid. And I know as a Christian, believing the Bible in the book of Joel, since my oath was always when I was in the Army as an assistant district attorney, as a U.S. district judge, as a chief justice of a court of appeals, as a member of Congress, my oath was always to the United States, the U.S. Constitution. And so I took seriously the book of Joel, where God is telling Joel why he's going to bring down judgment on certain countries. And he says, one of the reasons is because they have divided my land. So I didn't want to be part of dividing Israel's land and be a part of bringing judgment down on the country I took an oath to protect, which was the United States. So AIPAC was mad at me quite often because I went, I'll be glad to sign the letter, be glad to vote for the resolution, but not where it contains support for a two-state solution. I can't support that. And my friend Caroline Glick had a great book out on that very topic, and I was very grateful she did.
We're very grateful that you did that as well. America recently lost Senator Lindsey Graham.
Yeah.
Of course, he was an unapologetic supporter of Israel. How do you remember him? Were there things that happened in private that people didn't really know about about Senator Graham? What are your thoughts about him?
Well, Lindsey and I disagreed on some issues, but we totally agreed on support for Israel. And you know, even when we had disagreements over bills or issues, it's hard not to love the guy. I mean, he was funny, he was energetic, he was outgoing, and I was in Washington, and I was in, members of the House and former members of the House can go on the Senate floor, can go in the Senate cloakroom, and I was in the Senate cloakroom last month, and I was visiting with some of my Senate friends, and Lindsey was there, and anyway, I said, Lindsey, you remember some years back when I was invited to speak at this black tie dinner in South Carolina? It's been going on for over a century, and your job was to introduce me. And Lindsey just started dying laughing. He was so much fun. And he started dying laughing. He said, yeah, I remember. I said, you remember what you said is my introduction? And he died laughing. And he said, yes, I do. And the other senators are going, what did he say? What was it? I said, he got up there and he told some hilarious stories. And then he says, well, okay, the real reason I was asked up here is to introduce Louie Gohmert. And so all I can say is, and I'm paraphrasing, there are conservatives, but Louie Gohmert is bat poop crazy conservative. Here's Louie Gohmert. And everybody was just dying laughing. And Lindsey was sitting in his chair rolling. He remembered it, but he was a hoot, and everybody just fell out in this big ballroom that night. But so, yeah, Lindsey and I've shared some fun times, and then there are times we were both actually trying to get senators and House members to get on board with things that would be helpful for America, because, as you know, Daniel, the United States could never afford to set up an outpost to protect us in the Middle East like we have as a friend in Israel. And so it's good to have a true democratic republic like Israel there. And by the way, if I might, I hate to talk too long, if I might go on, Daniel.
Keep going. We're here to listen to you.
Back when the Obama administration was pushing for the deal with Iran. Um, I talked to Prime Minister Netanyahu. He was terribly concerned, but I'd also visited with other Muslim leaders in the Middle East and North Africa who were extremely concerned also. They did not want Iran having a nuke, and the Obama deal with Iran was going to allow them to have it in 10 years. And that's if Iran completely played by the agreement, which we knew they wouldn't, just like Korea didn't abide by the deal they made with Clinton. Uh, so anyway, it was just such a terrible deal. But in talking with the president of Egypt, President Al-Sisi, they were very, very concerned about how radical Islamic leaders in Iran would try to blackmail leaders like those in Egypt to do things or not do things if they got a nuke. It was going to terribly destabilize the Middle East, North Africa, and create massive problems for the United States. So, there have been a lot of things that we've had to work around and work through. In the 8 years of the Obama administration, it was a difficult time trying to make sure that our strong ally in Israel remains strong.
Yeah. Now, October 7th shocked the world. I want to know what your reaction to it was, and why do you think it produced more hatred towards Israel instead of sympathy in the long run?
Uh, you're familiar with Natan Sharansky?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, have you read his book, Defending Identity?
No, I haven't.
Yeah. Well, I was talking to Ron Dermer once at the reception in Capitol, and because I knew he helped Sharansky with his book about defending democracy. And he said, well, have you read his later book, Defending Identity? And I said, no, not. And he said, you really need to read that. So, Daniel, in there, he gives the answer to the question you just gave. And he says, a lack of morality prevents people from being able to distinguish between the firefighter and the arsonist, between the terrorist and someone acting in self-defense of themselves against a terrorist. And I think, Daniel, that's the answer to your question. In America, we have so lost the teaching of moral right and wrong. And we have had Marxists from the 60s and the 70s who found out, as my dear late friend David Horowitz explained, they found out they didn't accomplish things by blowing up buildings, killing people, riots. So they went to the universities, they got tenure, and they started teaching future teachers that Marxism is great. There is no true morality. Everything is relative. And now we're seeing the results, the consequences of decades of that kind of teaching. They can't recognize the difference between a terrorist and someone acting in self-defense against a terrorist. And Daniel, there's the answer to your question. It's a breakdown of morality in America so that so many here are not able to recognize the difference. That makes sense?
Yes, it does.
That was
Now,
He's such a brilliant guy. And I spent 2 hours visiting with him in Jerusalem one day, and it was just 2 marvelous hours. Such a brilliant guy.
now, what's the biggest thing that Americans don't understand about the Israel-America relationship alliance? I think years ago you said that America wasn't being as good of a friend to Israel as it should have been. Do you still believe that?
Well, we weren't at that time. We weren't being the friend to Israel we should have, and especially during the 8 years of Obama, he was rude to Prime Minister Netanyahu. It made him sit in another room until he could, like he was a child, until he could come around to see Netanyahu's view on things. I mean, and actually, you remember when there was a flotilla that came down from Turkey and challenged the blockade around the Gaza Strip? They were trying to keep out more rockets and weapons going into Gaza. You remember that flotilla
Yes.
and disaster when it challenged? Well, I don't
Yes.
think people noticed, but right before the flotilla came started, the Obama administration leaked out information about Israel having nuclear weapons. Well, that might be what you do to an enemy. And I'm not saying they do or they don't, but we've never leaked out information on an ally's, especially a close ally's weapon systems to their enemies. And they leaked it out to the world. And it was just a shot across the bow of Netanyahu at the time. And the world saw it. And they saw that this was a big schism between the United States and Israel. And immediately after that is when the flotilla launched. And as someone who's studied history my whole life, majored in history, have a degree in history, and never stopped studying it. But it's basically a truism that when an enemy of a country sees that country's strongest ally pulling away from that country, it's provocative to that enemy. They think it's time to act. And actually, that's what motivated. I was thinking, okay, what can we do to show the world that even though the Obama administration is showing more favoritism to Iran than they are to Israel, what can we do to show the world that Congress, at least, we stand with Israel? And then I thought about, well, that's the answer. Let them see Congress standing with Israel. And so I did a letter, and it was in the fall of 2010. It was after the flotilla. And I got, I don't know, between 100, 200 members of Congress to sign the letter asking Speaker Pelosi to invite Prime Minister Netanyahu to deliver a speech to a joint session of Congress. And I asked Speaker Pelosi if she would do that. And she said, well, I think it was in September. Here we are, and there's just not that much time to work that in before the end of the year. So we really don't have time to do it. And in looking back, I guess she's right, because we had a bunch of bills to name courthouses, and we had a lot of breaks we had to take. And I'm being sarcastic, of course. But anyway, when we won the majority in November, I immediately redid the letter and got tons of Republicans to sign on, delivered it to Speaker Boehner, and he invited Netanyahu to come speak. And I was just really emotional as we saw back then in early 2011, over and over, members of both sides of the aisle stand up and applauding the Prime Minister of Israel. That sent a strong message to the world. Look, there may be problems at the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue, but here in Congress, we support Israel. But now, years later, we have seen that support wane, and we have seen Marxists, we have seen Muslims taking over positions of power in Congress and around the country, like New York City, where 9/11 happened 25 years ago. And so we're not being the friend to Israel that we should be once again.
Yeah. Now, as you said, you've warned about Iran for years. President Trump was the first president to take military action. But what did you see specifically that everyone else ignored?
Well, I go back to the Iran agreement. It was a treaty. They called it a deal. It was a treaty because it changed terms of other treaties. Therefore, it should have required 2/3 of the Senate to ratify it. And they just ignored the Constitution on that. But I was concerned, as a few others were, that there were not adequate inspections taking place, even though that was part of the agreement, the deal. So a few of us went to Vienna and met with the two top inspectors, and they had just signed a report saying that Iran is totally complying with all of the terms of the agreement. They're not upgrading their uranium. So I asked these two guys, I said, you were never allowed in their top three military facilities, deep underground, one under a mountain. How could you sign a report saying they were in total compliance? You know what the answer was, Daniel?
What was it?
They gave us a video, and the video looked good to us, so we signed the report saying they were in total compliance. How about that? Well, they weren't in total compliance, and fortunately, President Trump has taken them to task, and he bombed those facilities. But they have not taken him seriously enough yet, and they think they're going to win, but apparently they don't know President Trump very well. He's not going to put boots on the ground, but he is not going to let them keep terrorizing people at the Strait of Hormuz.
Yeah. Now, for years, you've warned about radical Islam. Has America refused to confront the ideology behind terrorism? And what do you think the biggest mistake Western leaders continue making when it comes to radical Islam?
Well, for much too long in the federal government and some state and local governments, they have had programs called their outreach programs, where they would sit down together and make merry and have lovely conversations. And they were overlooking the fact that there were some imams that were teaching hatred against America in some of those places and doing a lot of damage. And some received large contributions from some Islamic groups and people. And so they think all is right with the world. This is great. Look how this is going. And all the time, there is a movement of Sharia getting stronger and stronger, and more radicalization within America itself. You know, we have no problem in America with people being here that have total allegiance to our Constitution. But we have a problem, we should have a problem with people who say, or whether their actions or their words make clear they are not going to follow our Constitution. And that's what's been overlooked for far too long.
Now, after spending almost 2 decades in Washington, are you more optimistic or more worried about America's future?
Well, I've stayed concerned, very concerned about America's future. When I went to Congress, I did not plan on being there for 18 years. I was an Eagle Scout. We were always taught you don't leave unless you leave a place better than you found it. And I kept wanting to leave knowing that Congress and the country were better off than they were when I got there. And it just seemed like so many things were getting worse and worse. And so I left to run for office in Texas, but a different office, but things are not good right now. We've got a super great president that's trying to get things turned around, but he needs some strong help in the House and the Senate, and he needs help from the states and state governments, and many of whom are thinking they'll just follow the old congressional line to get along, go along. And that was Sam Rayburn from Texas, the former speaker for many years. That was his line: to get along, go along. And they get along by going along. And the country continues economically, or rather financially, with too much debt and with too many programs that are funding the downfall of our government. And we're starting to find more and more of that. And I remember explaining one day, former Senator Phil Gramm was eating with some of the Texans one day at lunch at the Capitol. And I was complaining to him. I said, we got another appropriations bill, and there's all this money in there going to Democrat organizations that get out the Democrats to vote, that help fund their activities to come after Republicans. And we just shouldn't be funding all these things that are not for the good of the government. And Phil Gramm said, and he had, I think, more of an accent than I do, and he said, Louie, Republicans always feed the dogs that are trained to bite us. And so I went, well, yeah, we do. Too often we feed the dogs that are trained to bite us. And we got to stop that. We've got to start feeding what makes America greater and greater. And I know President Trump wants to do that, but we got to get Congress completely on board as well.
Congressman Louie Gohmert, I truly appreciate your time, and I want to thank you for your steadfast support for Israel. It wasn't always the popular thing to do, but you stay strong, and we truly appreciate it. And we wish you the best. And if you have any final words to say, you can, please, the floor is yours.
Well, we just need to be the best friend Israel has, and that needs to remain a constant regardless of what else happens. And we need to start educating our children immediately as to what a friend Israel is and how important it is to be their friend. And there is no moral equivalence whatsoever between a terrorist and someone who's acting in self-defense. And that's what Israel is doing.
Thank you, Congressman Louie Gohmert.
Thank you, Daniel.